Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Digging In with TPS-MTSU. We're really excited to have you join us for the latest in this series. As we get kicked off, just again, a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get into our topics of discussion for the month. Um, as always, again, we do record these, so be sure if you're joining us live to keep your mics muted. And we invite people to come join us live. Again, we think it's a great way to again interact and kind of make these a little, more interactive than just watching them later on YouTube. Although, again, we totally appreciate and love when people do that. So if you are with us live, again, be sure that you know that you can open your chat box, interact with us that way, say hello, ask questions, make comments. Stacy and I will be monitoring that throughout the session. And as always, of course, we do put all of the information for this entire series on one Padlet. Again, it's a fantastic resource to go back and look at any of the previous webinars, find the newsletter that's associated with them, any associated PowerPoints and those kind of things as well. So it's a great resource. We'll flash that up again at the end of the session, so don't worry if you miss it now. Again, we'll put it up at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy to get us kicked off in talking about our theme for this month.
Thank you, Kira. And can you hear me all right? Or, okay. Just checking on my volume here. So I'm gonna just do a brief preview of what our newsletter is for this month, which many of you may have already seen. We tackled elections again because not only is November an election month, but this was a presidential election month. And so we only get to talk about those every 4 years. And so we wanted to grasp that topic and think a little bit back on some of the elections that we've had in the US history and some of the weird quirks that have come up and changed processes in terms of how we vote for the people that we want in office. And so, to that end, um, we have linked to a lot of materials that we have already created and that other institutions have created that are pertinent when it comes to the idea of voting in elections. And so a lot of those are linked from this blurb on the first page. And of course, on our important links box on page 2. And so at the end, if when we talk about our resources, we'll point out a couple of these in a bit more detail. But the one that I want to point out right now is that there is an activity about how to process election results that you can do with your students. And so this is from Facing History and Ourselves. And so since we are all, in the process of, figuring out the results of the election and how that's going to impact us going forward, this might be something that can give you some talking points to do with your students. You have to kind of scroll down to the end to get to the activities for after the election, because there are also activities for before the election, but of course, that's past. So if you scroll down, you can get some ideas for how to talk about that if you're doing government and civics or contemporary issues or other kinds of classes where those kinds of conversations are part of your curriculum. And so today we're going to be looking at the 1968 Democratic Convention, the 17th Amendment from the early 20th century, and the election of 1828. And we're going to handle those discussions in chronological order. So in other words, backwards from what I just said. But I do want to point out that we have another lesson idea in this issue on voters and electors, and this has to do with, the electoral college and specifically looking at the election of 1876 as an example. And so that's our fourth lesson idea for this month. Then, of course, we always have additional primary sources on page 4. Um, we have used this image before of this campaign ball, but it's always a great one. So that's on here. The status of Puerto Rico and what they can and cannot vote for, what the 22nd Amendment is, and then the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, and some more discussion about those. And so I am going to, because our graduate student assistant writer who did the lesson plan for the election of 1828 had a conflict for today's afternoon, he pre-recorded his discussion about this. And so we're actually going to go to the video of Ryder discussing this lesson idea. Unfortunately, that means that those of you who are with us live can't interact with him or ask him questions. But hopefully, maybe Kira and I can field some questions if you have them in the chat box. So I'm going to turn things back over to Kira, and then we're going to turn things over to Ryder.
Yeah, so let me pull up the video here. Make sure that we are sharing sound so we can hear him good. All right, so
good evening, everyone. My name is Ryder Cowart, and I am a graduate student at Middle Tennessee State University. I work with Ms. Kira Duke and Dr. Stacy Graham on teaching with primary sources. I help contribute to monthly newsletters, and this month's theme was elections. And today I'm going to talk to you about the election of 1828, which changed the course of American elections. So the election of 1828 was President Andrew Jackson versus President John Quincy Adams for the second time. So the first time that they matched up against each other was in 1824. Neither party or neither candidate gained enough electoral votes to secure the presidency, so it went to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams won by one vote, which was Henry Clay, and Jackson supporters were outraged and called it a corrupt system. So the second meeting between them two was the hero of New Orleans, who's Andrew Jackson, versus the incumbent, John Quincy Adams. So Jackson's supporters, they tried to gain public opinion by talking about his military successes during the War of 1812, relating him to the common man as a frontiersman and an enslaver, saying that he is for the people, not against the people. And on the other hand, supporters of Jackson were trying to uh, make the public not like Adams because of his corrupt bargaining. He was a supporter of a strong central government. He supported a high tariff. He was lenient on Native Americans. They called him an elitist and an aristocrat because of what they considered the Adams Empire. His father was a president before him, and they came from a wealthy background. So, although the populace had already um, had like their certain opinions about him because of his presidency, and they didn't like things that he did, Jackson supporters capitalized on those negative feelings so that they could sway public opinion. So the path to victory, although this election was not the first election to use slander, defamation, and mudslinging. The first election was actually John Quincy Adams' father and Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. But this the election of 1828 solidified the use of slander, defamation, and mudslinging to become the new norm in American politics. Um, Adams knew that Jackson was gaining popularity across the country, so he had his supporters print newspaper articles and pictures in to circulate pamphlets to um, talk about how during the War of 1812 he executed six military officers. They called him tyrannical, um, bloodthirsty, a threat to democracy. They talked about how he and his wife Rachel, they got together before she was officially divorced from her husband and called them adulterers. So they tainted the election with this severe slander and defamation. This picture down here at the bottom, this one right here, it's called The Peddler and His Pack, and it is a depiction of John Adams. This is John Quincy Adams here, holding desperately to his throne of his presidency, and his supporters here are the are collapsing underneath the coffins from this uh, newspaper article here where they talked about, Jackson's military conquests, but they're collapsing beneath all of their slander and defamation because it did the opposite of what they intended for it to do. It actually pushed uh, the populace away from Adams and caused more of a divide. Um, the election of 1828 also saw the rise of the second party system. So it's where you have one party in the north, one party in the south, and they are uh, central to those locations. So in the north, you had the Republicans, and in the south, you had the Jacksonian Democrats. Um, and, it solidified oppositional stances and um, regional uh, politics. Um, this is also the first election where candidates started doing their own campaigning. So normally in elections before this, uh, the candidates were just chosen by other political entities in the country, and now they're actually going out and they're campaigning. They're holding rallies, trying to get more votes because there was a change in the voting rights um, shortly before this election where they were starting to phase out the requirement of white men owning property above a specific threshold. So there were more citizens that had access to voting. So they went out and they held these rallies and campaigned to try to gain public support so that they would be elected. That's how elections of today are held. The candidates, they campaign, they hold rallies, they try to sway public opinion. And that was all thanks to the election of 1828. So the lesson idea for this month is the photo from the previous slide, the peddler and his pack. You can use the hippo or the happy. They're both the same thing. They just two different layouts kind of to determine what the historical context of this time is. You look at all of the campaign materials and you can find out what exactly happened during Adams' presidency and why the public wants a new type of president, one that's not considered an elitist or an aristocracy. You can find out who the intended audience is. Um, the point of view, depending on which campaign materials you're looking at, will be dependent on who the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Depending on which campaign material we're looking at is dependent on who produced it. So the newspaper article of the coffins was produced by Adams supporters. The peddler and his pack were produced by Jackson supporters. The purpose, what was the intended use of these campaign materials? And then you could also look up some outside information or organizations, or you could also, on the happy graphic organizer, you have the significance. What was the significance of all of these campaign materials in the election of 1828 and in today's political economy or political climate? So discussions and reflections, what social and regional factors affected the results? How did Adams' attack on Jackson secure Jackson's victory? And how did Jackson's election change the function of politics and elections in the United States? All right, so that's all that I have for you today. Thank you so much.
All right. So again, that was Ryder's lesson. One thing that I want to note, I know he misspoke there once talking about the political parties. The Republican Party he mentioned, again, not the Republican Party that we think about with Lincoln. It actually winds up that it's one of those, again, it's kind of changing and evolving, and eventually what Adams is a Whig. So again, that's something to note. Again, the complexity of changing political party names during that time period. All right. So with that, we're gonna move forward just a little bit in history. Actually, both a little bit forward and a little bit backward. So for my lesson idea, I wanted to explore a little bit about the history of the 17th Amendment, which of course changed how senators are selected and come into office in the U.S. Congress. So for that, just a little bit of background, of course, we know in the Constitution, our congressional legislative branch is made up of both the House of Representatives, which are selected via direct election, and the Senate, which originally was selected by state legislatures. The thought behind that was, of course, that the House would be responsive to the people through direct elections, but the founders wanted the Senate to be a little bit of a check on that because they like their checks and balances. So the thought was that through having the senators selected by state legislatures, it would allow for more power to the states and would really be a way for the states to defend themselves against a powerful federal government. The other thought was that it would guard against kind of the overreactions of the masses, which they thought that the House might be more susceptible to. So that's how we start out, and then all of our senators are selected via state legislatures. And as like Roger mentioned, of course, when we get into the 1820s, we have the voting rights begin to expand. And as voting rights are expanded to more people, we do see there start to be more criticism of the process. And so really, this starts pre-Civil War, but by the Civil War, and then definitely by the time we get to the 1890s, there's a lot of criticism about how this process is set up and a lot of push for wanting to change it and maybe move to direct elections. To the point that actually some states have started doing that process on their own. Some had adopted what was called the Oregon method, which would allow voters to have more say in the selection of who the state legislature was sending to the Senate. So you already have, again, a push for that, but there had been senators and party leaders who had been able to kind of keep that momentum at bay. One of the concerns, of course, with a lot of the southern states was that they wanted to negate the power of African-American male voters because so they wanted to keep that in the state legislature. So that was one reason that the South had kind of held up any changes to this process. Well, by 1906, William Randolph Hearst, who you guys may remember, of course, being a very powerful newspaper magnate, he actually commissions an investigative journalist named David Graham Phillips to publish a series that's published in the Cosmopolitan, and again, not the Cosmopolitan that we think of today, but an investigative series called Treason of the Senate. And in this series, he looks to show how large corporations in league with corrupt state legislatures were playing too large of a role in selecting who was being put in the US Senate. Um, the series is wildly popular, and in fact, angers Theodore Roosevelt, who we all know is a very mild-mannered man, right? Roosevelt is very angry about the series. In fact, he says that it's basically like, a political hatchet job. Um, and he actually coordinates the term muckraker in reference to how angry he was at Phillips for the senators that he was targeting that Roosevelt considered allies. And again, this also leads, to a lot of criticism of that style of journalism, which again, we talk about muckrakers a lot with our students. So this is a great example of how that style of journalism actually had an impact because through this series, Phillips actually forces two senators to resign. Because of the allegations and things that are published in this series. But through subsequent election cycles, there are only 4 of the 21 that he talks about in the series who remain in office once they have come up for re-election after the series is published. The series is really thought to be the piece that kind of puts forward the final push to get the 17th Amendment passed, and which actually happens in 1913. So again, a little bit of background, it's really fascinating. But for the lesson idea, what I wanted to share with you guys, and let me pull this up real quick, find the right screen. All right. So you can start, and there's really 2 ways to approach this. So you can start with really just thinking about, what is the 17th Amendment and how did it change things? And so if you want to focus just on those pieces, there's really 3 sources that I would encourage you to look at. So one, of course, starting with the US Constitution. So you might want to have students focus on, this is Article 1, Section 3. And so really thinking about, again, how is the Congress made up via the original Constitution? So you might look at, again, how the House of Representatives is selected, but then you really want to focus on this part of Section 3. And again, thinking about that, every state gets 2 senators. They are chosen by the legislature thereof. So basically the state legislature, they're there for 6 years. Each senator gets 1 vote. And then the rest of it kind of goes into thinking about, again, this next paragraph is, how they were going to set up the original kind of cycle for getting them elected. So again, that we only re-elect 1/3 of the Senate each cycle, or roughly 1/3. So again, age requirements, and then some of the positions within the Senate. But really, again, this right here, this first part is the key thing that you want to focus on. So again, ask your students about that. Why might that be? And really get them thinking about some of the things maybe that they've learned when they were learning about the founding of the country and the writing of the Constitution and those things. Next, what was the debates around what the alternatives might be? So there's actually a really good pamphlet that I found, and we're going to look at this one twice. So the first time is looking at, again, what were some other ways and what were some of the critiques for some of those other possible ways of organizing the Senate. So for that one, I would suggest, again, there's one paragraph here in this, and I note in the lesson idea where you can find this in this pamphlet. And so he talks about, the 4 modes of appointing the Senate were suggested. And then this is in reference to the original Constitution Convention. So first I talked about, that it would be selected by the national legislature. So basically letting the House of Representatives pick the Senate. The second would be letting the president pick it. The third, direct election, so the people. And then fourth, the individual legislature. So again, that's the state legislatures. And then it goes on to talk about what were the critiques of each of these. So the first one being, if the House of Representatives is picking the senators, that would create dependency between the Senate for the House and the people who had the power to select who was actually in the Senate, and that would be a problem. If we let the president pick it, that leads a step towards monarchy, and we didn't want that. If we let the people direct election, that it begins to be a conflict of interest between the two great interests, the landed and the commercial. And so they were, of course, if we think about the founders, they were really a little afraid of direct democracy. So that's one of their concerns. And then the fourth, which was favored, again, this is letting the state legislatures pick it, would most likely provide some check in favor of the commercial interest against the landed. So again, thinking kind of, again, northern industrial interest versus southern more agricultural interest. So you could have students, again, think about this, think about were those critiques, still applicable as we get into the 1890s and early 1900s? What were the pros and cons of each of these arguments? And then, of course, looking at how the 17th Amendment actually changes things once it is ratified. And so with that, of course, we get here from, this is the Library of Congress, the Constitution annotated. So we see the actual text of the amendment. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator will have 1 vote. We don't change the qualifications. Really, we are just changing how they are elected. And then there is some language here about what happens with vacancies. And so, you might want to get into that. But again, the key thing here is just changing how we are electing those senators. Now, depending on your class, and if you wanted to get into it, you might also want to look at the debates of, pro and con that were happening as the constitutional amendment was being debated. So for that, again, using the same pamphlet that we looked at just a second ago, because this pamphlet is actually a whole argument about why the Senate should not be changed. There is one passage I thought really kind of encapsulates that. There are multiple others that you could pick, but if you wanted to pick just one kind of short passage, you can find it here. This is on page 10 of that document. And it says, "The Senate has been the bulwark of protection against immediate, hasty, and inconsiderate legislation demanded by the people, and conceded from time to time by the House. But it has always yielded to the sober, patient, wise, and deliberate judgment and the second thought of the electors." And so again, this was the thought that, again, by removing direct election and eventually removing the senators from being answerable directly to voters, that it allowed them to be more deliberative. It allowed them to make sure that the laws being passed in the country were like long-term going to be for the benefit. And again, that was their argument. And you often hear people talk about, the Senate being the most, one of the greatest deliberative bodies of government. And that's something that you even hear every once in a while. People will still mention that today, that is its, supposed to be its legacy. Now, what was the argument against it? And so, as I mentioned earlier, there was this whole series, the treason of the Senate. It's a very, very long series. You can find the whole thing online. I did find a webpage that I've linked to in the lesson idea where there is an excerpt that focuses on just one senator. This is, what is his first name? Sorry, he's from Rhode Island, Aldrich. Let me go back up here. What is his first name? Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. So within this one paragraph that I thought was particularly interesting, and again, thinking about, this whole allegation of, senators being selected because of kind of corporate interest and corrupt state legislatures. And so this paragraph, it gets into talking about how the senator, he really doesn't concern himself with the petty local affairs of Rhode Island. He doesn't really care about them up until it gets basically it's time to get reelected again. And he goes on to talk about politically the state is securely in the interest. So again, this is the corporate interest, and speaking of the senator, financially the interest, and he have incorporated and assured to themselves in perpetuity about all of the graft. And they talk about one company, the Rhode Island Securities Company, that capitalized and paying excellent dividends, that is basically making money off the state's streets and trolley lines, gas and electric franchises, etc. It began as a street railway company in Providence. And now, again, it's using basically taxpayer money to fund dividends to these corporate shareholders. And so really again, it gets into that, like, thought of, again, how these senators are just making money off policy and answerable more to business than they are to the people. So you could pick one segment of this and again, get into, again, what is the critique of that? And again, the pros and cons and have students evaluate that. So hopefully, again, this will give you a couple of different ideas of how you could approach teaching the 17th Amendment. I know myself in looking at it, I was fascinated by, again, the whole muckraking piece of this and Roosevelt's responses, and things that I didn't know before we started. So again, hopefully that will be of interest to your students and give you guys a little something to discuss.
Oh, thanks, Kira. And now we're gonna shoot forward a half century in time and look at the lesson idea about the Democratic Convention of 1968. And I am gonna try to pull together a lot of different threads on it. So I hope I'm not all over the place, but it's just like with the 17th Amendment, it's just all so fascinating. Okay, so yeah, right. So basically, I start off by noting a similarity between the situation that was going on with the Democratic Party earlier this year, and what was going on with the Democratic Party in 1968, because Kamala Harris, she was not a candidate during the Democratic primaries when Joseph Biden was still the candidate, and then he dropped out of the race, and she was able to claim enough delegates at the convention without having campaigned in the primaries. And so I said at the end of this first paragraph that she was the first person since Hubert Humphrey to win candidacy despite not having campaigned in the primary elections. And so, who's Hubert Humphrey? Well, I'm going to get into that in a second. But I did want to make a note, and this is a side note that doesn't really have to do with this lesson idea, that if you go back a little further, you can find another example that has to do with a Tennessee candidate, in fact. In 1952, Estes Kefauver of Tennessee won 12 out of 15 of the Democratic primaries, but was still passed over at the Democratic convention in favor of Adlai Stevenson, who had more support among the kind of the influential members of the party at the time. And of course, Adlai Stevenson went on to lose spectacularly to Eisenhower. And I'm kind of wondering if that's one reason why Tennessee voted for Eisenhower in the general election. And on that note, I did want to point out a couple of the important links in the box right here next to my lesson idea. And I'm going to pick one out right now because it kind of goes with that. And I can't get to the link if that black box comes down, and it comes down every time there's a, hang on, let me see if I can move it. There we go. I'm moving it to the bottom. There we go. So you can see the political party's primary source set at the Library of Congress teachers page. And this is a neat way to just kind of browse through different primary sources about the formation of political parties and, the history of them in our country. As Kira mentioned, there's no the Constitution of the United States does not talk about political parties. And so what those political parties do in terms of choosing their candidates is not a constitutional matter. This is something that's been decided over the years, and can be chaotic at different points. And so hence the chaos of the 1968 Democratic Convention. But I did want to point out one of these sources in particular. This is from 1970, and it's, okay, I opened it in a new window apparently. Okay, let me go back to opening it in a new tab. There we go. That way you can see it, I hope. And so this is a book, a national atlas of the United States of America that shows you all the election results from the general elections and what states voted for. And just, it stops with, 1968 because it was published in 1970. But I thought it was really interesting to see if I'm just looking at Tennessee, how Tennessee sometimes votes with a lot of the other southern states and sometimes it does not, because I think there is a perception of the solid South, but it's not always the case. And sometimes Texas is the outlier, which I think is also interesting. And sometimes it's a different southern state. And okay, this is on one side of the page, you can see all these different election results. And then over here on the next page, it starts with, excuse me. Yeah, so the 1888. And so if I went to, for instance, the 1952, then you can see how Tennessee voted for Eisenhower, and so did Virginia and Florida, and Texas, but the rest of the southern states voted for Adlai Stevenson. And this is not for the general election. No, I'm sorry, it is for the general election. But that's because in the Democratic primary that year, Stevenson was kind of pulled out of nowhere, not out of nowhere, but upset the expected candidate, which would have been from Tennessee. But then Estes Kefauver also lost the next election as well. So but then Eisenhower won that again anyway. Okay, so that's just to show you one of those examples. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be looking at I can't look at the chat box while I'm doing this. So if there's anything kind of pertinent, you can pipe in, Kira. But I did want to show one more thing from the important links box, and that's the very top link, because it's this really good presentation from the Library of Congress about presidential elections and voting. And, how it is that you choose the candidate for the presidential election, as well as how you vote for the actual person for president. And so it goes through 3 different themes. And so I was looking at the nominating candidates, and then it takes you through different eras in history, as you can see over here in the left-hand column. And, trying to figure out how to do this when there's no provision for it in the Constitution was something that, the founding fathers had to grapple with, and that kind of went through some different changes with the development of political parties and then political conventions in the 19th century. And so when I got to this last one, the modern era, 1968 and afterwards, this is what inspired this lesson idea. And so I pretty much use this as the activity so that students will have and teachers will have a very easy kind of reference guide. And that's all it is. It's 4 primary sources with little blurbs talking about the narrative and then forming conclusions with discussion questions. And so I'm going to get back to some of these sources in a second. Before we get into the 1968, though, I do pose a question about, okay, how do we choose the nominees? And each state, of course, might have a different system. So there are caucuses, there are primaries, and there are open primaries, closed primaries, mixed primaries. And if you want to know what Tennessee's system is, there is a link here. And I will also go ahead and tell you that so if you go here, you'll find that Tennessee actually has closed primaries. And that means that you can only vote in the Democratic primary if you're a registered Democratic voter, or if you say you're going to register for the Democratic Party when you go to vote. And so the pertinent piece of of the law is linked to from here, and I have to tell them I'm not a robot for the fifth time. And so this just shows you what Tennessee law says about that. Um, and okay, so the pertinent piece of information here is um, okay, so you can vote in a primary election if you are a bona fide member of and affiliated with the political party in whose primary the voter seeks to vote, or at the time that you go to vote, you declare your allegiance to that party. So, you know, that kind of prevents voting in a different primary, which, yeah. So this is an interesting article that tells you what all the different states' systems are like. And so you can look into that further from that link. And then there's another link to what the differences between the primaries and the caucuses. And this is a pretty good website here that it's a government website, but it goes into some really good but easily explained detail. And so primaries, of course, are usually closed ballot, so you vote privately, whereas caucuses can be like that, but they tend to be very public declarations where you physically move to one side of the room and you try to get undecideds to join your side. And so I think that's really interesting. If we had to do this, you know, how does it change the process, whether it's private or public declaration? I know that tends to change the way certain Congress people vote when things come up in the House or the Senate, if they're on the record or if it's a private thing. So, so those two links right there would be really pertinent if you're teaching that government and civics standard. But if you're doing history and geography, then you want to probably get more into the 1968. What do I mean by chaos? And so this has several links that will take you to some content about the story, but there's also a video, and I'm not going to show it during this webinar, but it's from Retro Reports, which is this educational website that does, does short videos on all sorts of different historical topics that you may already be familiar with. And I thought it was a really good one. It interviews a couple of the people who were there at the time, one from each side. Well, not like there were only two sides, but, you know, from different perspectives. And then it has images from primary source photos. And it does a pretty good job about kind of boiling down some of the major issues. And it's less than 10 minutes. And so that's why I ended up selecting it. There was also one from PBS NewsHour that was pretty good too, but it was a little bit longer. So I know that your time in your classroom is valuable, so I picked the shorter one. So basically, what happens is this is in the midst of the Vietnam War, which is an extremely important piece of context because there's a growing anti-war movement in the country. And President Lyndon Johnson is under pressure to end the war. And so a growing number of American voters want an end to the war, and a growing number of Democratic voters want there to specifically be an anti-war plank on the Democratic platform going into that election. But that is not the case right away. And so the vice president is Hubert Humphrey, and the main challenger to LBJ in the primaries is Eugene McCarthy at first. And he comes out flatly as an anti-war candidate, but nobody thinks that he's really going to go far. So he really surprises everyone when he comes in a very close second to Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. And so that kind of makes people reevaluate that, all right, we do want change. So what can we do to show that we are serious about having an anti-war candidate, and it doesn't have to be LBJ. So this is when Robert Kennedy Sr. comes in, and he presents himself as a viable alternative. So you have LBJ, the incumbent, and you have Eugene McCarthy, and you have Robert Kennedy. Um, And then, of course, the in the midst of the Vietnam War, there's a major setback when the Tet Offensive reveals the extent to which the U.S. is not prepared and not doing as well as it had led the American public to believe. And there is a lot of criticism of LBJ at this point, and he ends up dropping out of the race on March 31st. 1968. He drops out, he removes his candidacy, even though this is in the midst of primary season. And so he says, he throws his weight behind Hubert Humphrey, but it's too late to campaign in the primaries. So Hubert Humphrey did not campaign in the primaries, and so they're, going into the convention season with McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy being really close. And then, more context, in April of that year, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and that leads to a lot more public protests, wrapping in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And then later in April, Hubert Humphrey, enters officially as one of the candidates. And then in June, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated on June the 6th, 1968 in California after it looks like he was going to cinch the nomination. And George McGovern comes in to kind of pick up, where Bobby Kennedy left off, but he doesn't get a lot more support outside of that. And so it's a real turmoil, both inside the convention and outside the convention, because we are now in August, late August of 1968. The convention is being held in Chicago because Mayor Richard Daley really wanted to show off his city for this convention. But he also wants to make sure that nothing bad happens. So he brings in the police and National Guard, and there are protests. There's a lot of anti-war protests that are going on outside of this convention. And then inside the convention, it's, the system was a little bit more chaotic than it is today. There were a lot of the delegates were still uncommitted because they could be. And then you had what are called favorite son delegates who supported the favorite sons of their own states instead of the, official party, candidates. And you had your establishment kind of party bosses who were more in support of Hubert Humphrey because he was kind of a known to them. He was an establishment candidate. And then of course, on the larger scene, the Republican candidate is going to be Richard Nixon. And then of course there's a third party candidate with George Wallace, the Alabama governor, who comes in to spice things up. Shall we say, he's of course running kind of anti-civil rights. And so the first of these links, I'm just going to show you kind of there is this cool story map at this website called History Pin, where you can see the different places that some of the kind of clashes and important events associated with this convention occurred in Chicago. And what I like is that when on some of these, and I'm going to kind of scroll through a little bit quickly here, um, they superimpose the historic photo of what happened in 1968 on top of what it looks like today so that you can see in the landscape where these things happened. So, like, for example, here are the protesters in Grant Park. And here they are clashing because there were, I don't know, apparently, permits were granted to allow for the assembly of these protesters, but then permits were revoked at the last minute on some sort of charge. And once the permit was revoked and these people were already there and assembled, the police move in, and there's some violent clashing going on here among the protesters and the police of Chicago. And so this is grabbing national headlines, and everybody, is glued to the TV, not for the reason that Mayor Richard Daley wants. But yeah, so you can see some. And, 7 of the people who were involved in this actually are put on trial later this year, and it's called the Trial of the Chicago Seven. And protesters on Michigan Avenue, this was actually referred to as the Battle of Michigan Avenue. This is going on outside the doors, while inside the doors, the delegates are debating very heatedly about whether or not they should come out and blatantly support withdrawing from the war. This is a very fraught time. So the other link is just a PBS site that has a very short kind of contextual blurb that might be helpful for you to reference or to assign to your students to read before they go into the primary source activity. And there's also the link to the video. And so for the analysis activity, you can look at the other sources. They're especially the photographs, I think, are good, and we'll look at that in a second. But then I'm focusing on the fourth source. Now, I have 2 links to it, and I will explain why in just a second. So if you look at the 4 sources, you have a photograph of what's going on inside the convention, and you have a photograph of what's going on outside the doors of the convention. And so those are a really good way to kind of talk about what is the tension here, how are they the same, how are they different, and how is each of them going to be resolved. And then there's some news coverage. This particular page is more sympathetic to the police, and so that might be a good way to kind of bring in multiple perspectives for your students. And then this 4th source that I'm going to zoom in on remarks about how did they decide to fix this problem later. And so the reason I have 2 links is because that exercise only links to 1 page within the larger record. And I wanted to see what was, I wanted to read the rest of this paragraph. I wanted to turn the page. And so I found where this source was located on the congress.gov website within the Library of Congress. And so if you just go to the 3rd page of this is where it starts. And then you can, turn the page if you want, or just stay on this page if you want. But before we get to that, I should say that the main upshot of this is the recognition that the person who emerged as the party candidate was not reflective of the will of the majority of the voters. And that is fundamentally undemocratic. And so the Democratic Party had to use this as a learning lesson to look inside themselves and figure out how can we be more democratic and pick our candidates so that they better reflect what the majority of our voters want in a candidate. And so there was a commission that was established in the years after this, and it was actually headed by George McGovern, one of the candidates who came in after Bobby Kennedy's assassination. And it was the McGovern-Fraser Committee. And so in 1972, it issued this report, and that's what students are going to be reading. And so basically, if you start in the middle of the second column and you can go on for as long or as short as you want to kind of see what the soul searching of the Democratic Party revealed. And so basically, they are saying it exposed profound flaws in the presidential nominating process, but in so doing, it gave our party an excellent opportunity to reform its ways and to prepare for the problems of a new decade. So the delegates to the convention, concerned by the chaos and divisiveness, shared a belief, etc. And therefore, they took up the challenge of reform with a mandate. Of course, mandate is supposed to represent the will of the voters, to give all Democratic voters a full, meaningful, and timely opportunity to participate in the selection of delegates and thereby in the decisions of the convention itself. And it goes on with a lot of really interesting wording about, okay, so what did they find when they looked into it? Where did they go wrong? They left out a lot of minority voters, they left out a lot of women voters, etc. And so if you to actually get to the guidelines that they issue, which are more technical, so it's not something I think that's going to make as much sense to students. You can just go down a few more pages. But they have the history of the commission, why it came about. But I think that basically, the second half of this first page here, and maybe a little bit of the next page, would be more than enough to provide your students with some talking points. And so that was the upshot of that. They want to increase the number of caucuses and primaries as being one of the ways to combat this problem, and decrease the influence of a lot of those party bosses and influencers who weren't actually delegates. Now, unfortunately, some of these reforms will be walked back in the 1980s with the reintroduction of superdelegates. But that's a story for another time. So I'm going to flip back to Kira.
Thank you, Stacey. So hopefully, again, looking at these topics, we've given you some different things to think about and ways to teach elections, and again, how different elections have impacted American history in different ways. So as we wrap up, again, just a reminder, you can find all of the resources that we've referenced on the Padlet page. So definitely be sure to check that out. We also, if you are interested in receiving PD credit for today's session or for viewing this recording, you can find our form to do that either using this QR code or using the link, the web address that is there. Again, we manually generate these. I check these about once a week and send them out. So again, feel free to go and submit yours after you view the video, and then we will get that out to you in about 1 week's time. We will be back next month on the second Thursday of the month, which is December the 12th. Next month, we are talking about diplomacy. So again, if you're interested in joining us for that, just shoot us an email. We'll be happy to get you on the registration list for that. And thank you guys so much for spending time with us today.